Hey guys, Dave from Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds. Hang out with this nerd.
Nerdarchy is Ted.
And we're going to give you some tips, tricks, and advice on how to run a better Theater of the Mind game.
Jump down the description below where you can sign up for Nerdarchy the newsletter, get weekly gaming tips, as well as learn how to game with Nerdarchy.
While you're down there, you can also look for the link for the guidelines for D&D 5e Narrative Theater of the Mind Combat by Sly Flourish. Someone brought this to our attention. I believe it was Chief and Nerd Editor Doug Vahovic for the Nerdarchy website, and said, hey, this is pretty cool. Maybe you guys should do something with this. And he was right. It is pretty cool, and we should do something with this. Because we run a style of game that is somewhere between Theater of the Mind and Grid. And depending on what medium we're using, it may be all Theater of the Mind.
Well, a lot of times when you get into, for us specifically, online gaming, we don't use any of the other Fantasy Grounds or Roll20. So there's no combat grid to look at. We don't run any kind of tools that would allow us to have access to that. So we just say, oh, this is what it is. Typically, I take one of the points from here and I allow players to dictate, oh, what about this? For instance, I ran a game last night and the guy wanted to be, in combat with one of the creatures they were fighting with no one else within 5 feet. That's what was ideal for his character. So I'm like, absolutely, that's the way it is. Had he wanted an ally within 5 feet, there would have been an ally within 5 feet. Because tactically, that's the way these things are going to set up when you're playing with a grid.
That being said, there would have been an ally within 5 feet if an ally wanted to be within 5 feet. So I guess that would be the only caveat that I might add.
Right. So I try to plan in a way that, or play in a way that would allow them to maximize the use of their characters.
Now, we really do like Theater of the Mind, and I guess we should talk about, we've mentioned it in plenty of videos, but we'll talk about a little bit of why we use Theater of the Mind now and how we kind of got away from using Theater of the Mind 100%, right? So my earliest gaming, there were no minis, there was no maps, it was all Theater of the Mind. My DM for really complicated combats would maybe get a piece of paper and it would look like a football, a football plan with the X's and O's, just to make it easier for us. And that always worked fine. Fast forward a couple years, we start, which is the first incarnation of the Nerdarchy gaming group before there was a Nerdarchy. And we played with a very antagonistic GM who very much it was you versus them style of gaming. And, the problem that we had was, he would do things and say things with Theater of the Mind that were completely different than we had in our minds as the players. So when we started, one of the things we did to combat this.
I was going to say, a specific example was I was playing a wizard and there were fighters that were typically going to be in the front of the battle. We were fighting ogres. I envisioned myself far enough back that there was no way that the ogres were going to be able to attack me. But because there were an equal number of ogres to party members, he just was like, well, I'm just going to have one attack everybody. And I'm like, but how? Did they just walk through the fighters to get to me?
Well, and that's an earlier edition of the game where if you were doing 3rd edition, that would be Theater of the Mind. It would have been legitimate, but there might have been some attacks of opportunity that would happen. So it was partly like a fault of the GM and partly, the game that we were playing. So from there we said, all right, well, we're going to use a grid, and we didn't buy one. We just bought a sheet of plastic and got a T-square and made a grid. And, we would use dice. And we would use, dice, D4s and D6s.
D4s were the good guys, D6s were the bad guys. And that's just how it was. So you would flavor, your whatever color you felt was most appropriate to your character. That's the D4 you put down.
And this just allowed us to kind of get positioning on the battlefield and see things really quickly and kind of like neutralize the jerk GM if necessary. And from there, we kind of evolved to more of a grid style play where it's like, okay, everything's Theater of the Mind until combat breaks out, and then we lay out the minis. But now, fast forward 20 years, we're doing more Theater of the Mind when we game online. Our philosophy as GMs has changed greatly since that time. So I think it's a lot easier for us to run Theater of the Mind.
Well, it's It is a different style of play, both in evolution of the systems, but as well as evolution of the gaming styles. As you mentioned, the antagonistic GM style was a bit of the norm, and well, I don't see very many of them these days. And when I do, like, people tend to, to like, why do you run that way? What is the benefit for you or for the group to run with that kind of style? And they begin to think about it. So
Hopefully.
hopefully, there's no way to really know. But when we look at this, document, it really sums up that whole point to be in the player's favor, and that antagonistic style of running isn't going to do that.
Now, I find when I do theater of the mind, like for area effects and stuff like that, I generally just go, oh, you can get most of them. So if there's 4, you can get 3. If there's 5, you can get 3 or 4, depending. Or like if I feel like the way I've described things and the way they're doing things, like in one encounter, it was like 6 chokers, coming down an alleyway. It's like some of them on the walls, some of them on the ground, and all kind of like freaky crawling at you. And the player's like, fireball, and I'm like, well, choker chunks everywhere. But really, like, I'm like, well, what's cool? What is cool for the players to do? I had a scene in one of my last sessions where, the paladin's mount was left with a player that wasn't there the previous session. So the mount was able to take them to the action, and they would just get there around late. And it like charged the wall of the building because it was the second floor, and then it like totally put the brakes on just before the wall and like bucked to try and throw the player, through the window. Now the player made a handle animal check and they were able to like cling to the thing. But when they're like, hey, they're like, well, I'm not doing it that way, and then they do it their own way, and they're like, well, I want to try and like climb up there or pole vault up there or something, and I'm like, okay, make an athletics check. You can do that easily as part of your movement. It's a really low check, and let them do it and get into the action. So, now it's more about like what's going to be fun, what's going to be more interesting for the players than, how can I get them? But to that end, maybe you're a new GM and you're playing Theater of the Mind, and you could use some basic guidelines to kind of help you.
And that's that brings it back down to the document. So it talks about movement, distance, and range, and you really are getting rid of that whole speed category or stat, if you will, to just say, okay, things are either close or they're not. If you've gotten to combat, then realistically you're going to be able to get to anyone, and anyone's going to realistically be able to get to you, unless there's extreme circumstances. You've got positioning, opportunity attacks, and cover, and it's a brief little paragraph that goes into how you would want to do this, how you would want to do that.
That nearly breaks down to what you described from your game the other night, like the way they describe it there.
Then you get into area of effect. So it's like, all right, if something is a tiny area, like a cloud of daggers, well, that's only going to fill one square, so you're only ever going to be able to get one creature. Something like a thunder wave or burning hands, you're probably going to get 2 out of it. Cone of cold, fireball, you're going to get 4. Earthquake or circle of death, that's just going to hit everybody. Wall of fire, probably going to hit 2. Lightning bolt, blade barrier, 3. And then you can take into account, well, what is realistically the grouping? Is that going to allow for more or less, similar to the way you were talking about with the chokers? Fireball hit them all because there was no way for it to not.
Yeah, there was a group of them. Like some of the things you're like, oh, well, it's a 20-foot room and they just throw a fireball in there. Everybody in there gets it. So there's going to be like really easy things to abdicate like that. And hey, you know what? Sometimes it just happens that way. Your players just score a big win and there's not really a fight. And that's okay. You can always just throw another encounter at them later.
Absolutely. So then it comes into like tips for players and tips for DM. Describe what you want to do. This is for the players. Use the features of the area. Don't worry about specific distances. Focus on your intent. Really like that one. Try awesome ideas based on the situations. And describe the character's actions within the story. So that to me gets that whole narrative in there. For push mechanics aside. Worry about what it is that you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to do it. And that adds so much more to the game than worrying about, mechanics.
So, to add to that, from that same game, I have a player that's inexperienced, but she's really excited to play the game, and she's always trying to do things in the game that what the game doesn't really allow for. And she's like, "Hey, for my first attack, I want to kick it. I want to drop kick it, or kick it." I was like, "Well, okay. So what do you want to do? You want to try and knock it over?" And she was like, "Yeah." So like a kick attack would be a point of damage and not really worth doing, right? So I'm like, well, how can I make this more meaningful for what she's trying to do and affect the game? So I'm like, well, do you want to make that kick, like trying to knock him over? And they're like, yeah, I like that idea. So then we roll a grapple check, and the monster loses, so it gets knocked prone. Now her second attack with her glaive, she's able to, get advantage on the attack and get a possibility of having a better roll. And it also puts the monster in a better position for the rest of the party. So that comes back to, what is the intent of the player? And as a GM, you might have to like pull it out of them a little bit, and you might have to like wrangle and miss a match a little bit to try and get the best result for the mechanics of the game, right? Don't penalize them because they try to do something cool. Instead, if they offered up a suggestion that mechanically is a bad idea, how can you turn that around to make it a good idea and keep the spirit of what they wanted to do? And, that's going to make the game more enjoyable for them, for you, for everyone at the table. And it's going to make these like fun and memorable moments.
Absolutely. So then the tips for the DM is, each turn describe the character's circumstances. This allows for, as the battle changes and flows, as they're wont to do, it gives the players the option or the ability to capitalize on new circumstances. Offer options to help players meet their intent. That absolutely would be, what you were talking about with that kick scenario. You mechanically got her to where a better thing could be. Be generous. Give the players the benefit of the doubt. That's what I described in regards to the scene from last night's game. Use skill checks to help characters try crazy ideas. So if you aren't certain of how that things would wind up working, if there's a skill that they can do, number one, it's going to bring skills into the game more heavily, make them more important, but that's going to allow them to get better success because they're using something they are already good at. When needed, use sketches, abstract maps, or miniatures to show complicated locations and relative positions. This just pushes things a little bit out of theater of the mind in those dire circumstances or in those really challenging
Complex,
areas.
when things are complex.
So that's it in a nutshell.
The cheat sheet. But it's one page, it's simple, but if you follow this, I think it will add a lot to your game. And like, here's the key, right? As a GM, as a DM, just try not to be a dick, right? Ask yourself if, are you doing something just to screw your players, or are you doing something to make the game more interesting and more fun? Because if you give your players enough opportunities, they will screw themselves. And that's when you stick it to them. Not because you made some arbitrary ruling that's lame. Like, for instance, in that same game, the party randomly encountered a boule mating ground. Now, had they decided to try and fight the 4 boulets that were there, I would have ripped them apart. I would have destroyed them. I would have had no problem with killing every one of their characters and eating them. They are boule chum now. But they didn't. They ran away. And, I made some checks, and the 3 that are fighting for the right to mate didn't notice them. They were busy. Guys act really stupid when a woman gets involved. We all know this. But the female boule was like kind of disinterested, just waiting to see what happens. Like, oh, look, there's Meals on Wheels over there, a snack in that wagon. So she went to investigate and try and get something to eat. And, it was a fight that they could handle, and they were able to kill it. And, they were able to run away from the rest of the boulets and survive. Now, there is going to be plenty of times that your players are going to do things where maybe they're going to imperil themselves, and you don't really have to.
I fireball all of them.
I had my players. Yeah, that would have been a good one. I had my players, stumble across a Yanti Pureblood, or maybe it wasn't the Pureblood. It was whatever, one of the ones from the back of the Monster Manual, which is like the snake guy, with the snake torso. I forget the name of it. But I was like, man, like I rolled this randomly as an encounter. I was like, man, I think they're toast.
The Abomination?
It might have been the Abomination. And they were actually able to just keep out of its range and keep peppering it to death. And like through tactics, they were actually able to win the day.
Nice.
And, I didn't help them. I didn't give them anything. And there's lots of encounters like that can happen in your game. And there's lots of room for them to actually take the rope and hang themselves. So you don't really need to try and screw your players or be a jerk to them just because you feel like you need to make it challenging enough. It'll happen. And when they make the mistakes, that's when you kind of give it to them for those mistakes. And that's how I kind of run my game.
So what do you guys think? How are you handling narrative combat in your games? Are you? It's a great place to continue that conversation. It's down in the comments down below. While you're down there, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
You can go hang out with us over on Facebook.
So until next time, stay nerdy.